Hey there, guys. It looks like it's time to finally get working on some client-side code. After putting a lot of work into building an API for authenticating a user and managing their profile information, it's time to build a Vue application that will work with this API. Let's review the diagram of the various applications we'll be building. You can find this repository or this diagram in the repository's README on GitHub. And just as a reminder, if you've been living in a cave or not paying attention, this repository can be found here, and it's always going to be linked in the video description. What we've built so far is a sort of Docker development environment with Docker Compose. That Docker Compose so far sets up something called Traefik. And what Traefik does, and this Traefik is also a Docker image and container that we spin up, it receives incoming requests, and depending on the URL, it routes traffic to various services. And what are these services? For example, one is the account API we spent a whole heck of a lot of tutorials working on. And this account API is hosted inside of Docker. So Traefik basically can route these URLs or paths to specific Docker containers. What we're going to do today is set up a container, or at least a development container, that can host the account client, which will be a Vue application for logging in and managing the basic user information. So this is kind of where we access, or from where we access, the account API. We'll scaffold this baby out, and we'll end up doing a basic fetch request to one of the endpoints in our API account. As I've thought a little bit about this application, I understand that it doesn't always make sense to host your Vue application inside of a Dockerized environment, as there are so many easy hosting services for single-page applications that will automatically set up a CDN for you. Nevertheless, for the purpose of routing with Traefik, I think it's easier to host everything inside of this single environment. I want to show you now the tool that we'll be using to scaffold out our Vue application. You may be very familiar with the Vue CLI, or if you're hip to the Vue ecosystem, you probably are aware of this new tool called Vite, which just changed its logos. It's pretty nice looking. Now, if you want to know what this is, I guess you can click the Learn More button, and we have a nice introduction here. And it basically has a dev server for using native ES modules, and it has very fast hot module replacement. It also builds your Vue application using rollup. And the thing is, it's very fast, and that boils down to, especially on the first build, it's faster than using Webpack, which the Vue CLI or Create React app use, because it uses this ES build. I'm not an expert in all this, but it is fast. Now, Vue CLI was never a deal breaker for me, neither is Create React app, but this is it feels lightweight. The first load is really fast, and so this seems to work really great inside of Docker. Let's go now to getting started here on the left menu. Here we have exactly what we need, how to scaffold our first Vite project. We're going to scaffold one with the name of account client instead of my Vue app. Please do take note, though, if you are using npm 7+, that you will need this second dash. What I'm going to do is just copy this, and we're going to go into our project's main folder and run this command, of course, changing the name of my Vue app to account / client. Also notice that there are templates for setting up TypeScript, which I've used, and these work just great. I've also used it with React. I'll mention, though, that sometimes using Vite with legacy or older libraries that don't export ES modules have some problems. I know it's supposed to work around this in some way, but I did have trouble working with AWS client libraries inside of an AWS Amplify project. Not a surprise, we all know how bloated and vast the AWS libraries are. I've opened up our project now, and you can see that we have the main memorizer folder, and inside of that we have the account folder. So make sure you're at the root of the project, where we will run that npm init command. use @vite.js/app, and then we're going to call it account/client, and we're going to use the Vue template. This will be pretty quick. The project is not very big. Plus, it does not install the dependencies as some tools, which is why it was so quick. Make sure we change directories into account client and -client. And we can install this now. While that's installing inside of account client, I want to add some configuration files. This is kind of annoying, but it's necessary. So the first one I want to do is just a simple file that my dev tool called Vite uses. So if you go to extensions, a lot of people in VS Code use this Vite extension. And so to know where your source files are, we usually have to add a file called JSON config.json. And actually, I had that right the first time. This is actually a jsconfig.json file, not JSON config. And if you're using TypeScript, you would just use the standard tsconfig file. All right, there we go. So we're basically just saying to look for files inside of this source folder. I also format my code with prettier. In fact, Vite is set up to use prettier. So I want to have a basic prettier config. And so I'll add a prettier rc.yaml file. And I will copy in some basic settings. I like to use the trailing commas probably because I do a lot of Go development, but you probably won't like it. I know a lot of people don't like these. So you could set this to none. Now that we have some of this stupid, silly configuration done, let's open up the main source folder here. And inside of app.vue, I really don't care about the default template of Vue. I just want to make a simple h1 tag saying scaffolded app works, or whatever you want. Works. Next, this, as you can see, is using this script setup syntax. I'm not that familiar with it, so I will get rid of this. I have not investigated what that is. You can see that my tools are already giving me a warning that our Vue component doesn't have a default export. And so you can see down here, we're not doing that. And maybe that's what the setup allows, is to not have an export. Let's now export a component. And I'm going to do so in a way you may not be familiar with if you're coming from Vue 2. But Vue now has an exported function called define component, which you can import from Vue. I guess I said it's exported, so that goes without saying. And what this does is gives us some typing help. So instead of just exporting this object, when we wrap it in the component, let me delete this. For example, if I type name, you see it kind of gives us a list of properties, or I can hit Control Space. And so you kind of know what's in here. You have a computed property, methods, watch. So these are all the fields that Vue can have. So I think that's kind of nice. I recommend wrapping your components this way. And we named this app. Now let's just run this locally to make sure stuff is working. And in fact, let's also delete these assets for now. We're not using this image anymore. And let's delete this hello world Vue component, which we are no longer using. Now inside of this account client folder, let's now run npm run dev. With the Vue CLI, I think it's Vue serve, but in Vite it's dev. So let's open up localhost 3000 here. And you saw how fast that was, I hope. And this is a small project, but that was still lightning. And there it is, scaffolded app works. Great. I just noticed I still have some styling from the style tag. I'll leave that for now. We'll end up adding styles in the next tutorial. Let's now get this environment up and running with Docker. And the way we do that is to define an image inside of a file called Docker file. Just capital D. I don't know if that's necessary, but just like that. No dots or extensions there. We're now going to define the image from a base node image. We're going to use the node Alpine image of the long-term stability type. So that's going to be in the high 14s now. We're then also going to put our app inside of the /app folder. So that's the working directory of the Docker container or image. And then I want to add this environment path variable, and I want to append our app folder's node modules and then the binary folder of that to the path. I didn't need this when I previously did this application with the Vue CLI, but it seemed to be necessary when I was using Vite. But basically that just means if you look in our account client folder, there's always this bin folder inside node modules, which gives us commands, very importantly to things like Vite and rollup executables that we want to run. So we just want to make sure when this, if we go to package JSON, when npm run dev gets built, it just says Vite, and so it knows to look inside of our node modules. We then want to copy both package and package lock.json to the app folder. And since we're in the work directory app, we can just use // here. We want to install the dependencies, and then after that, copy the rest of the files over. So anytime we make changes to the files, that change will be reflected inside of the running container, and it will be running because we use the command npm run dev. Before spinning this up and getting too excited, let's add something called a docker ignore file, which prevents files from being copied with this copy ... into the Docker container. So let's say docker ignore, and I just don't want to copy anything about Git or the node modules into the container. Now to get this up and running with the application as a whole, remember that in the root folder of Memriser, we have this docker compose.yaml file. This has set up the reverse proxy, which routes our traffic to the various apps. That is using Traefik Proxy. They've kind of changed their marketing names. I think they call it Traffic Proxy now. They're trying to do a lot of stuff, and it's tough to keep up with the marketing. But they did send me a t-shirt for the first video I made on their tutorial, so thanks. It took 2.5 months to get here from France, and I don't know if that's shipping or just French bureaucracy. Love you, French people. But I did previously work for a French company, so I have some experience in that bureaucracy. This company is much smaller than the one I worked for, though, so they probably have less bureaucracy. You probably don't care about any of this, but you do care about the account client service. Make sure this account client is at the same level as like account and Redis account. So these are the various services, account and Redis and Postgres that were necessary for our API. This time we only need a single service to run our development view. Now, because we're running all these multiple folders, we need to tell the Docker Compose where the Docker file is. The way we do that is with the build key, and then under that a context key, and then we can use a relative path to say look in account client folder. This setting the image to account client was something that was funny with using Traefik to route traffic to our container. I'm not 100% sure why we needed to add that. We need to make sure our container exposes port 3000, and then this ports command forwards the 3000 port of the container to the outside world. Very importantly, we use these labels when we use Traefik in Docker, and so we want to explicitly make this container available to Traefik. By default, Traefik exposes all the containers, but I have overridden that if we go to the actual Docker setup here, or Traefik setup, I should say, with a setting called exposed by default false, because I didn't want to expose our Postgres container or Redis to the outside world. So like in the account application, we have to explicitly enable Traefik, and likewise for the account client. And it depends on, then we have volumes, and this basically just creates a link between our account client directory and folder and the app. But to avoid copying the node modules, which I did do in the Docker ignore, but usually the settings I see for Docker for like React and Vue say to use a node modules anonymous volume in your Docker Compose file to avoid overriding the node modules that you install inside of the container. And lastly, this container will not work right, or it should not work right without the reverse proxy. And in fact, I did not add that to the account application or service, so let's also add that here. And was it? It's with this dash, right? Yep, reverse proxy. I think we're now ready to spin up this account client. To run the Docker Compose file, we need to go up one directory, And I'm going to run Docker Compose, but only on the account client for now. So when we run Docker Compose up by itself, it will run all of these services. But since we're not connecting this account client to anything else, it'll just be a little quicker to run account client by itself. You can see it's installing all of the packages right now. And it would look like our application is up and running. Now this says localhost 3000. But remember, and I did not explain this very importantly, and this is maybe the most important thing, we are routing to this localhost 3000 via Traefik, and so we should be able to go to malcorp.test/account, and then we have to actually include the /after account as well, I think because of how Vite is set up, and then we should be directed to this localhost 3000 inside of Docker. Let's give it a go. So instead of localhost 3000, let's now do this malcorp.test and then /account/. All right, something's not working. Failed to load resource. What could that mean? Some of you, when using Vue CLI or setting up Vue on AWS or whatever it might be, might know that if your account is not running at the host and then just /, meaning the root, you need to add some configuration to the Vue CLI or AWS or whatever server is hosting your site. And what we need to do is add a configuration field called base, which exists inside of the Vite config. So if we open up account client again and go down, when we scaffolded the Vite application, it created this vite.config.js file. If we go back to the Vite documentation here, let's see, we have this config section, and that's where you can find all of the configs. And it turns out the setting we need to set is this base setting. And you can see that we need to include the trailing / here. So let's go ahead and do that now. And it's just at the root level of this default object that's exported. And so we have base. Oops, that was emit. And then the base needs to be account, because that's the name we're using inside of Traefik and where we expect our application to be. Let's go back to the main site here, and let me increase the size because you guys are on small screens. And let's run this. There it goes. Scaffolded app works. Let's maybe go back to VS Code. Let's go to app.view and maybe try scaffolded app works well. And let me control save. Let's flip back to the browser and it updates. I won't show you the fast reload, but you'll see that it works just fine. Let's now make sure that our application is working properly with the API. I'm in Postman and I have an update available evidently, but I have this memorizer folder with the various API endpoints to our application. Let's make sure that that application is up and running. So I will close the account client here. And I will run it again, but with everything. Normal Docker Compose up so that we get our account API and Redis and Postgres all up and running. Okay, so we see that our API is up and running. This little log here showing the various endpoints means that our Gin framework is running inside of the Go container. Now in Postman, I think what we'll do, since we have all these endpoints that are a little complex, I think the easiest thing to do is we'll submit a GET request to me, and that way we can see that everything is working in our Vue app. What happens if we make a request to the me endpoint, but let's say we do not have any authorization? So we just send a plain request with no body here. Let's see what happens. We should get an error with a type field called authorization and a message that says must provide authorization header. Let's see if we can get this error message into our Vue application now. I'm going to add a setup function inside of here, and that's a function. The setup function is used in Vue 3, and it allows us to use composition to build our Vue components. Basically, we're going to create two reactive properties, one that can hold the error code and one that can hold the error message. And on mounted, we're going to fetch our API account me. And remember, these two applications both have the same URL of malcorp.test, so we can just reach out to API account me from within Docker, since this application is running inside of Docker. And I don't think we need method get here because that is the default, but let's do it anyway. We will extract the body using the response.json method, which is async. It returns a promise. And the response's status will give us the number status code, which should be a 401 authorization error, as we just saw. And then also from this body, we can extract the error field and message field. If we go back to Postman, remember that's what we had. We had error and then message. And to set these reactive fields that are refs, there's another type called reactive that can store larger objects. We can just set its value. And then to make these values or these references available to our template, we return them in an object from this setup function. Let's now add just a couple of little headers to show these errors if they exist. So below this H1, let me add some VIFs. So if there's an error code, show it. And we don't need to access the value from within the template. View handles that by itself. And then show the error message if it exists. And it should exist. So let's save this. And hopefully if we go to our application, we'll see the error and the message. And we get an error saying ref is not defined. And it is not defined because this ref type you actually need to import from Vue, as well as the on-mounted. So one thing about using this composition API is that you don't by default just get access to this on-mounted function or these refs. You need to import them from Vue. So let's import ref and let's import on-mounted. Now let me try to save again. And hopefully this time, there we go. And that's the warning from last time. And this get shows us we have an unauthorized error. So we get error code 401 and that beautiful message that was in Postman. All right, folks, this seems to work just great. Next time, we'll work on installing dependencies like Tailwind CSS, Axios, and Vue Router. Vue Router might be overkill for this application, but hey, learning to set this up with Vue 3 and preventing us from navigating to pages that we're not authorized to view is something very useful to know. Hasta el próximo video, nos vemos y que se cuiden.